This is our 6th event, the last for the semester, last for 2020 in our Scholars Forum in the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. I'm Nancy Enright, the director of the University Core. And this series developed because several of us became aware that a number of our faculty, and it's really quite a number, have books recently published or being published this year. And therefore, the Core, partnering with the program and the Center of Catholic Studies, the Department of Religion, and Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, is excited to offer these glimpses into some of our wonderful faculty scholarship. Dr. Justin Anderson, who has taught for the Core and conducted faculty development sessions for us as well, and who is an author for our Core 2 textbook, will be presenting on his new book, Virtue and Grace in the Theology of Thomas Aquinas, with Cambridge University Press, July 2020. Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan said, "A university is a reproductive organ of cultural community. Its constitutive endowment lies not in buildings or equipment, civil status or revenues, but in the intellectual life of its professors. Its central function is the communication of intellectual development." With that in mind, I'm so pleased that Dr. Anderson, who is Associate Professor of Moral Theology at Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, is our 6th presenter. Before we turn to Dr. Greg Floyd, Core Fellow and Director of the Center for Catholic Studies, to give our introduction, I would like to mention that Dr. Todd Stockdale will handle our Q&A at the end of the talk. And so I turn it over to Dr. Floyd to give the introduction.
Thank you very much, Dr. Enright. So this afternoon, we are happy to have our colleague and my friend, Dr. Justin Anderson. Dr. Anderson is an associate professor of moral theology, although he's a philosopher by training. I just feel obliged to note at the outset here, which is high praise and not a critique coming from me, at Seton Hall's Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. Academically speaking, if you'll permit me a local metaphor, Justin is a bit like an August day in New Jersey. He has too many degrees. He has both an STB and a licentiate in philosophy from the Angelicum, an MA in philosophy from Gonzaga, and an MPhil and Ph.D. from the Catholic University of Leuven, where he wrote his dissertation in philosophy on Thomas Aquinas entitled, "Is Thomas Aquinas a Virtue Ethicist? A Critical Examination of Thomas Aquinas' Conception of Virtue and its Relation to Contemporary Moral Philosophy." Justin, I gather the answer is at least a qualified yes, or I'm going to need to seriously rethink how I teach Aquinas. Dr. Anderson, it turns out, is one of the very rare breed of academics, and by that I mean those who've had an intellectually fruitful sabbatical. To note only his most recent accomplishments since his 2018 sabbatical, he has published 2 different books and a spate of articles. His most recent articles suggest a mind that is capacious, not very often at rest, and in a style very appropriate to Leuven, is not afraid of a good disputatio. One of his recent articles is entitled, "Is it better to die excommunicated than not follow your conscience? What Aquinas famously never said on conscience and church authority." I think more than a few of Casey's former professors at BC might have to revise their lecture notes. Dr. Anderson is also a scholar, clearly at home in the rarefied and recondite climes of medieval philosophy and theology, as his recent book chapter, Thomas Aquinas and Medieval Canon Law, 2 Cases of Gratian's Influence on the Summa Theologiae, demonstrates. But as a most recent article shows, he's also someone who can bring these insights to bear on pressing concerns, as evidenced in his forthcoming "When Must One Permit Scandals to Arise?" A comparison of two traditions, prompted, I know from our conversations, Justin, by the mishandling of the abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. His first book, co-authored with Kenneth MacDonald, was published in May 2019 and is entitled "Pursuing the Honorable, Reawakening Honor in the Modern Military." His most recent book, as Dr. Enright pointed out, was published just this past July with Cambridge University Press, and it is entitled "Virtue and Grace in the Theology of Thomas Aquinas." Justin is clearly a scholar, Dr. Anderson working at the height of his craft and also one working in the borderlands, but some might say the badlands, between philosophy and theology. This can often make for very uneven terrain, and it certainly often makes for strange bedfellows, but it can also produce work of real relevance and significance. I look forward to discerning the details today of his recent work on Aquinas with him. I cede the floor to the gentleman from Lewis Hall.
Thank you, Gregory, and thank you, Nancy. I just want to second what a great initiative this whole thing is. I mean, and just kudos to everyone who makes time on one of the last days of classes with everything bearing down on us that you come and listen to such medieval speculation, but I hope it's somewhat relevant. So, so I have a bunch of sort of notes here, and I thought of kind of talking through it a little bit. I guess what I'd like to do is really with my time, and I'm more interested in any questions people have usually than what I have to say. But to give you a little bit of a taste, right? I guess that's what a little presentation here is meant to be. Is I'd like to start with just a little bit of a story of how I got involved with this project, and that might give you a little indication of the stuff that I'm kind of passionate about when it comes to research and everything, and hopefully trying to find that golden mean amongst all those different things that I seem to fall into with different thoughts going here and there. So I think there's a golden thread there. And then the second thing I'd like to do is just take you through. I have my little guy here of the book. I'll take you through just the basic argument and some of the basic chapters and the kind of the thrust of it, and then I'll just leave it there. And if we want to go deeper in one place than another, if you want to hear about where I actually do and gently disagree with Lonergan, in two places, I'm happy to say that, but I'll throw the grenade into the room right now, so you don't have to wonder about it. So how I began, awkward story. I mean, sort of an awkward day. I went to go see a professor. I was at the Institute of Philosophy in Leuven. This was 2007. Standing in his office, and it's just sort of this awkward small office with this sloped, roof that, we're both fairly tall guys, and we're talking about a project. I'm looking for some kind of specification. I know I want to write on moral philosophy. I know I want to do something with Aquinas, but I was kind of fascinated by virtue. I didn't really know what to do with it, and so I was kind of hashing it out with him a little bit, and he was sort of a stick in the mud. He kept saying, no, that's not good. No, that's been done. So I thought, oh boy, all my good ideas are taken. And lo and behold, there was a knock on the door, and some like fellow working on the pipes or something came in, and so this professor had to stand up. And so now there's three tall guys in this awkwardly small room, and as this guy sort of gets behind the professor's desk, is working on the pipes and everything, I start sort of saying, I just making small talk and saying, well, I had this sort of thought. I found it odd that so often in sometimes in the Catholic world and in philosophical things as well, there's this huge turn to virtue. Everyone's talking about character. Whether you're talking about engineering ethics, it's all about character and not sort of dicing up the individual acts. And yet at the same time, I said, there was this whole Humanae Vitae thing in 1968. And there you find Paul VI, St. Paul VI now talking in terms of natural law. And it sounds like he's using sort of Thomistic reasoning of natural. So I kind of said, well, which one is this? Is Aquinas sort of this sort of virtue person that everyone's kind of turned him into, or is it kind of natural law, which we heard for so long? Like, how do we think about sort of the primary real estate of Thomistic ethics? And he stopped me and he says, I was just sort of making small talk about what I was thinking about one day on a dock, on a lake in Washington State. And he said, well, now that's interesting. And that became, as Greg Floyd mentioned, sort of the title basically of my dissertation that took 4 more years or some. Is Thomas Aquinas a virtue ethicist? And initially, as I started that journey, I really thought that I would pursue the question as I pitched it to this professor. Is he sort of to be understood in his moral science? I like to call moral science. That way I got to stay away from saying that it's philosophy or theology. But in his moral science, is he more in terms of talking about virtue? He's organized his secunda secunda according to the virtues, not according to precepts of law. Or is he really this sort of natural lawyer? And that was my expectation when I started the dissertation. My discovery was much different. My discovery was that much of Aquinas's thought on virtue and the way that he was most unlike our contemporary philosophical context was buried within his account of grace. And so there I was at my dissertation defense, fast forward to 2011, and Carlos Steele, a great sort of now retired philosophy professor in Leuven, was on my board, my inquisition, and he asked me, he says, "Why aren't you across the park?" And that's Leuven speak for, there's a park that sits between the Institute of Philosophy and the Faculty of Theology. So, you know, what are you doing in philosophy, basically? Here you are, you've written this dissertation. And this book is not, I should say at the outset, this book is 10 chapters developed out of one chapter of my dissertation. So much of my dissertation meant taking account of contemporary accounts of virtue from Anscombe and all these sorts of things back in there. So that's a very different part. I haven't, that doesn't fall to this yet. But one of the things I recognize, and again, you know, Greg Floyd, as usual, sort of sniffed out the difficulty here, is the pressure sometimes that we face between delineating philosophy and theology. And maybe not so much that we face, but oftentimes the medievals had very different understandings of what that meant. You know, most of the time that Aquinas refers to the philosophers, it's in the past tense. Philosophy was of a bygone age for him. And while he certainly depends on philosophy, when it comes to philosophers or schools of philosophy, those were things that would be unbefitting for a Christian to belong to, because it would be somehow ascending to this, you know, we lack the light of Christ. So he certainly used and utilized philosophy, but as far as, you know, being adopted into a school of philosophy, I think it's safe to say that Aquinas would find that very foreign, if not unchristian. So all this sort of like what counts and where those borderlines are, the Badlands. So it became difficult to accurately read Aquinas on virtue, I discovered, if we follow his own rationale and at the same time completely ignore his theology. And one of my frustrations that I sort of vent in this book, and I'll read to you a little passage before the end, is what I've come to call sort of Thomistic Pelagianism. That I think there's a great many accounts of Aquinas's presentation of virtue, which actually is, by trying to be too philosophical, it prescinds from his own rationale of understanding virtue and how it's interrelated with grace and with God's divine action, both on a natural and a supernatural plane. And then it becomes very difficult to see it as something that Aquinas himself would A, recognize, and B, accept. So anyway, one of the things I learned was this difficulty between philosophy and theology. The second thing I learned in my own discoveries was that Thomas Aquinas was a human being. And human beings change and human beings develop. And this is, maybe I didn't realize it. Maybe it's in the water. Nobody told me that this is what we do in Leuven. But apparently this is what the Institute of Philosophy has long done, is been very sensitive to the diachronic reading of the angelic doctor. And he is an angelic doctor, and he is the common doctor of the church. And I definitely believe that. But sometimes with that comes this idea that Thomas Aquinas is, because he's angelic, he's less than human. He's outside of development. He's outside of even doing about faces. And so I was told, for example, I remember one professor at the Angelicum said, you know, beginners read the Summa Theologia, experts read the Summa Contra Gentiles. And I've just come to say, I think that's really bad advice. I think they're very different genre, and one was certainly written after the other. And like most of us in our careers, there are aspects. I mean, Aquinas is extremely consistent in the main, but there are aspects of his thought that have developed, and by that I mean deepened. And there are aspects of his thought that have utterly changed. That is, that he's reversed what he said in previous works. And sometimes those are quite profound. And so his theology of grace is one such area where he did an about face in some aspects of that. And that's very much to the I mean, one of the people that sort of discovered much of this was Bernard Lonergan in Grace and Freedom, his second major work, I think after Verbum and just before Insight. So Lonergan is someone that I do engage with in this book, but of course studies have gone further on into this development and whatnot since Lonergan's writing. So that journey for me, I guess this sort of discovering what's going on in Aquinas hasn't really stopped. And my dissertation was, again, not just Aquinas, but also contemporary virtue ethics. So I tend to be someone who I enjoy looking at the medievals for how different they are, and yet how strangely historically cousin-like they are to us, and therefore have a lot to sort of throw on to ourselves to get to know our own understanding of how we look at things by seeing someone, a progenitor who's actually similar yet different enough. I like that interplay very much so. And that's a little bit of what kind of, for example, led me to be interested in the pursuing the honorable. What happened to this notion of honor, which 500 years ago was very much part and parcel of the common person's understanding of their ethical life. And yet today it's sort of been vacuated. We think of dignity, we think of rights, but we don't think of having our honor offended. We sort of giggle if someone says that, right? I mean, it's sort of like, what's this about? I like doing that in the context of military, because that's some place that honor still sort of a place in our own society, which still somehow has some leftover residue for sure. That makes sense to them. So anyway, this sort of interplay between old and new, I really like this, and I think it shows us a lot. So I hope that's what this book is about as well. So I'll say something now about the book itself. I see I'm talking already too long. I'll try to cap it soon. So Virtue and Grace in the Theology of Thomas Aquinas, I think it's a boring name. I wanted it to be a little bit more spicy, but it turns out Cambridge didn't want a Latin title. Go figure. So I stuck with this. But anyway, what's this about? I would say the fundamental premise and of this work is that God is far closer to us in Aquinas' understanding. God is far closer to us than our own contemporary imagination might permit us to think. And in a certain way, I make the argument that Aquinas' own way of looking at virtue demonstrates this. So Aquinas' notion not only of operative grace, but analogously of human action on the natural plane, incorporates the idea that we hear in Philippians 2:13, that is, that it is God who works in you to will and to act. And this is a verse, for example, there's a few biblical verses that Aquinas sort of in the passages I'm looking through and everything, he really comes back to again and again. And that's that notion that God is, even on the natural plane, much more close to us and working with us in an unseen way than sometimes we recognize, and all the more in the realm of grace. So what I do here is not just grace, but I do a lot with human action on the natural plane. And therefore, I also not only talk about virtue, but I also talk a lot about sin. And I talk about the corrupting effects of sin, which I think is one of those aspects that's greatly ignored in Thomistic literature today on virtue. So this book is in 3 parts. The first part is basically introductory. The first chapter, so first part, 3 chapters. The first is just a general introduction to his notion of virtue. And I actually wrote it with the hopes that it could be ripped out and handed to students, is what I do in a burst of humility to my own students in fundamental moral theology. And so this sort of general introduction, what does he mean by virtue? And I try to work it up from the ground so people can see. And then the second chapter, in a sort of Wittgensteinian twist, I try to pay attention to his language, and therefore the different senses of virtues, this different senses of virtue. Because Aquinas has at least 5 different gradations, if you will, of what he would call virtue, from false virtue to, all the way up the ladder to fully fledged virtue, or in the Latin, virtue simpliciter, right? Virtue simply speaking, without any qualification. And that's an important distinction between, let's say, virtue, full-fledged virtue, virtue simpliciter, and that next level of virtue, that sort of 4th gradation, which is closest to perfect but is still imperfect, that he calls virtue secundum quid, that is virtue according to or under a certain aspect. What I tell my students is it's virtue with an asterisk. And for my sports fan, I say it's virtue, it's Barry Bonds virtue, right? It's virtue with like, okay, you got the home run record, but sort of. So the 3rd chapter is one of my favorites. it tries to trace, in broad strokes, it tries to trace the historical landscape that Aquinas was preceded by in terms of sort of a Platonic revival that's happening in Paris or around Paris in the 12th century, then the influx of the rediscovery of nature that's happening even on Platonic terms, and then into this context, into this feverish discovery of nature, then comes the Aristotelian corpus of what counts as a science, a demonstrable science, a scientia, and what counts as nature. And so there's this sort of already this feeding hunger that's happening in the medieval Western Europe prior to this Aristotelian corpus being poured in through translation. But certainly that translation affects greatly. And then with the rediscovery of nature, Lonergan fans, you can pick this up, comes, once you can delineate nature in a more Aristotelian way, theology is let loose to think about what's its proper place in the university, what's its scientia. The opening questions of the Summa Contra Gentilis, the opening questions of the Summa Theologia are this. What place does theology have in the university now? The university system that's both evolving but very much changing. And then finally, that sense of the supernatural. Because now once we can talk about the natural, we can talk about the supernatural, that which is above nature. So anyway, that's just the backdrop. I talk about Aquinas' own developments that were acknowledged by Thomists even 6 years after his death. I mean, so the fact that, you know, and there's a whole list of these, they're published, it's mostly in French, but also in Latin. And I pick out of those specific theses on grace that Thomists for the last 800 years have known that Aquinas did about face on. I mean, not only did he develop, but he also just changed. He actually said what I said previously was wrong. And so those theses become really important. The second part of the book, I consider virtue simpliciter, that is virtue which is infused virtue. It is virtue with the theological virtue of love. And this theological virtue of love acts to form all the other virtues, thinks Aquinas, to bring us to our ultimate happiness, which is heaven. I mean, so this is a very theological, grace-endowed notion of virtue. And when he speaks of perfect virtue, when he speaks of sort of virtue simpliciter, when he speaks about virtue that's just not qualified, I actually argue that more or less, I mean, you have to make arguments from passage to passage, but more or less, he's talking about a very theological notion of virtue. And so I talk about this in chapter 4. What's the beginning of this virtue? Well, it's grace for him. You have to have sanctifying grace as a necessary condition for this notion of fully fledged virtue. Can I prepare myself for that grace? And this is where he switched. Early in his career, he said, yeah, you can prepare yourself by acts of virtue for this grace by which you'll have fully fledged virtue. Later in life, after discovering some long lost anti-Pelagian Augustinian tracts, probably in the 1260s around Orvieto when he had access to the papal library, he flips. He says, he comes out in the Summa Contra Gentilis, he comes out in the Summa Theologia, and he argues that no, that's Pelagianism. Really what he had held in the Supra Sententia of Peter Lombard, he said, that's Pelagianism. And so we cannot even prepare ourselves by acts of the acquired virtue for this fully fledged virtue. So this really changes the way we think about virtue in Aquinas, of course, with grace. I go on in chapter 5 to talk about the continuance, perseverance in that life. Aquinas says that takes another grace I cannot merit. I talk about the end of virtue, of course, heaven. And then in the third part, which is another great sort of fun part, I do the same thing. I talk about the beginning, I talk about continuance or perseverance in this life, and I talk about the end. But now I take up that more philosophical notion of virtue that's possible for Aquinas, authentic virtue. He does think it's possible, but without grace. It's imperfect, but it's true virtue, certainly. And it's an ingrained disposition. He really thinks that, right? This is someone who's really practicing the virtues. These are the acquired virtues without grace. Many people today talk about that as pagan virtue. But what he simply means by that is graceless virtue, right? Virtue without grace. And you don't have to be an unbeliever to have that, thinks Aquinas. You could just be someone who's in mortal sin and not have that, right? Because all you're lacking is charity. So anyway, So in the beginning, I talk about the beginning of that, that sort of life of what are the necessary conditions to have this, right? To have this sort of graceless virtue. I talk about the process as how he understands human action and the process of human action, the interplay between reason and will, for example, and how his understanding of will, did it develop, did it not? There's another disagreement with Lonergan, sorry, there. And then the whole idea of divine application, because Aquinas, like most medievals, except for one medieval, and I don't ask me to remember who it was, I forget now, but except for one medieval, we oftentimes think of the Christian stance as God creates and then holds things in being. And that's called conservationism to them. But they were not mere conservationists. They actually believed that God moved people on the natural plane into action. So for example, why do I desire this thing, this object, now, here? Why do I have this sort of tendency? Why do I sort of find myself moved to pray or let's make it easy, right? Some good act. That can be God actually sort of moving me, even without grace on the natural plane. So, okay, that's very messy. I'd have to go in and explain it more, but that's what I kind of do in that part. In chapter 8, I talk about how is it that one can continue and persevere in a life of this graceless virtue, remember, without grace. And we have to take into effects the corrupting effects of sin. And again, so I really go through what does Aquinas talk about sin, its corrupting effects, and how is it that he remains so positive that those without grace can have authentic virtue throughout their life, and yet acknowledge seriously that sin has ever corroding effects that we ourselves can't deliver ourselves from, we can't redeem ourselves out of. So that's kind of another thought there. Boy, I'm really making a meal of it now. I'm going really fast, but I'm trying. And then the last part talks about, is there a pagan happiness? Is there an unbeliever's happiness? What does that look like? And here I get myself in a whole heap of trouble by attempting to talk about the Henri de Lubac Surnaturel, and everything else. No, I talk a little bit about that. Is how do we think about the order of nature and the order, the supernatural order, in talking about happiness. Chapter 10 is simply a confirmation. I simply go back to his definition of virtue and say, see, I'm right. Nobody actually talks about his definition of virtue, but it's highly theological. He defines virtue, amongst other things, as that which God does in us without us, which is very much in terms of grace. I mean, it's hard to get away from that. I'll just if you'll entertain me for a bit, I'll say something about I'll read something now that I've muttered through the rest. Let's see here. This is from the conclusion. I'll try to say something about this. So I've talked a little bit about his account of grace, his account of sin, and his account of God's divine providence and governance of creation on the natural plane in light of virtue and all of these things. The book is virtue and grace, but really it should be virtue and all of these things. And I say one place this interlocking relationship between all these terms of reference becomes starkly apparent is in Thomas's mature account of the theses of Pelagianism. Therefore, I have written often in the preceding chapters of a certain danger in some contemporary rendition of Aquinas' account of virtue. Some of those renditions fail even to acknowledge the difference between virtue simpliciter and virtue secundum quid, often speaking of virtue without any qualification, as if it were possible without God's grace. These renditions, attempting to be complete accounts, fall into one of two errors. On one hand, they speak of virtue secundum quid as if they were speaking of virtue in its fullest sense. Then they fall victim into the fallacy of what the medievals called simpliciter et secundum quid. It's when you begin to confuse these two things. Something should be qualified, but you don't qualify it, and then you're in trouble. They thought it was a logical fallacy. Explored at the end of chapter 2. On the other hand, if they speak of Aquinas' account of virtue, and either by omission or by giving scant mention to the influence of and necessity for grace, omit its inherent relation to his treatment of grace and sin, then they reproduce what I have called a certain Thomistic Pelagianism. Of course, neither rendition is faithful to Aquinas. In fact, we have good reason to think Aquinas would have directly argued against both. So at the very end, I turn finally in the last few paragraphs, I do say something about my dissertation question. What does this mean for Aquinas? And I'll end here. What does this mean for how we understand Aquinas and how he compares to our own contemporary philosophical discussion of virtue, contemporary virtue ethics? And I basically say that, well, contemporary virtue ethics doesn't mean having a theory of virtue. Kant had a theory of virtue, and nobody thinks Kant was a virtue ethicist. It means giving virtue a very basic term of reference in your moral science, moral philosophy, moral theology. And in that terms, and based on what I said about Aquinas and grace, I don't think, to answer Dr. Floyd's question, it's a very qualified, yes, very qualified. I don't think that Aquinas's notion, his understanding of the moral life and the role that virtue plays is as basic as some contemporary philosophers want to make virtue in their own understanding. It certainly is paramount, but I don't know if it's a pure virtue ethic, what contemporary virtue ethicists call a pure virtue ethic. That is, virtue's at the base and nothing else. There's a sort of qualified virtue ethic today that philosophers will speak about where you have virtue as a basic term of reference, but you also allow obligation or law, for example, as another term of reference. And if you do that, then I think you might be able to say that Aquinas is a virtue ethicist. But interestingly, most contemporary virtue ethicists today, to my knowledge, prefer a pure virtue ethic. And if that's their definition of contemporary virtue ethics, Aquinas doesn't cut the mustard. So that's me. I'll leave it there. Hopefully that was interesting. So. Thank you.
You're muted, Todd.
Thanks, Greg. Justin, I did say that certainly was interesting, and thank you so much for the presentation. I also want to congratulate you, as the others have, on your book. Friends, we have about 25 minutes together to engage in conversation with Justin and his work. The way we do this is hands can go up in the chat, as our students do for us, and I'll just kind of moderate that, inviting you to share your questions with Justin. If you would like to just put a question in the chat, you're more than welcome to do that as well. And I'll kind of try to monitor the chats as well and get those questions to Dr. Anderson as well. So, Greg, your hand is up first. I don't know if that is because you're not satisfied with the qualified answer that you got or not, but I'll invite you to begin engaging with Dr. Anderson.
Thanks, Todd. Justin, thank you for a great presentation. I just want to confirm that I heard you say Aquinas is not a virtue ethicist and he is a deontologist. Is that right? No,
yes, deontology being a very modern category, probably about 150 years old. Sure, if you want to say that. No, that's not okay.
I just wanted to follow up on your last comment and ask sort of what is the other either equiprimordial or more basic term than virtue in his system, if we can call it a system, or are there more than one other term? But
yeah, great question. So I took a stab at this more in my dissertation than I did in this work. I thought it'd be easier to stay away from it. The best, I think one of the candidates would have to be right reason. But again, I would emphasize that would need to be understood in a very theological, rich backdrop. And where you would go in Aquinas' own language in the Christian tradition would be eternal law. And that's fuzzy because it says, well, law's in there, so law must be basic. Nah, he defines eternal law as God's reason, divine reason. And so what makes my reason right, like actually authentic right, is not just that I'm thinking I'm doing the syllogism correctly, but that it's sound, that it's actually true. And that means that it's measured ultimately against the creator's reason. So I guess that's a closest, and there you're going to get law, you're going to get a stem off to law, you're going to get a stem off certainly to all true virtue, which has to follow prudence, which is right reason about right actionable things. But does it really bring in enough? Is grace enough? The theological backdrop has to be, so you get sin in there. That might be a candidate, but I'm not sure I want to say that there's only one basic term of reference that we can narrow everything down in Aquinas. I'm not sure about that. So that's a great question. Jury's still out, but that's what I'd say.
Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. And Jason, your hand is up next. Before you share your question with Justin, I'd like to just point this out. Lisa has put this in the chat, that there's a copy of Justin's latest book that has now arrived in the library. So there was a bit of a backup, and we have now finally gotten a copy of that, and it should be available soon. So thank you for sharing that, Lisa, and for your colleagues, Justin, to know that the book is now in the library and will be available soon. Jason?
Good. Thanks, Justin. That was really great. I really like the whole project of thinking about these sort of two polar opposites with Aquinas of natural law versus virtue ethics. And your talk made me think of another juxtaposition sort of question that I always have wondered about in Aquinas. When I was an undergraduate philosophy major, I read a book that compared Aquinas versus Molinism, and Aquinas was held up as the absolute determinist versus the sort of free will thing. And here I find myself in all of these Catholic circles where everyone is saying Aquinas is the person who talks about free will, and it's all about free will in Aquinas. And that's having read a book about Aquinas as deterministic as you can possibly get. And so you sort of alluded to this, but maybe you can now fully solve I think you did answer my question, but now you can kind of fully explicitly answer it. Would you say that this is sort of the change that you described, the early Aquinas versus the later Aquinas, or why am I getting these two sides to Aquinas as determinate or free will?
Yeah, great question. So I'm thinking of Molina and the Molinist more in terms of like God's causality.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really, and of course the other one there is Bañez in the 16th century. So that kind of gets caught up in what we call like, it gets caught up in my discussion of what I call divine application, that whole human action part that kind of gets explored. And I do have to sort of tease at that, but I try to get out of, because I'm stepping on so many landmines in the book already between nature and grace and all this. But so I try to sort of get away from the 16th century debate. So I'm not sure, and I'm not an expert in it, so I probably wouldn't. That being said, I've read Molinists who sort of say, this is not Thomas Aquinas' position. so it's another thing it's one thing to say, well, Molina was right. It's another thesis to say, and Molina was echoing like Aquinas is in our court. I've read Molinas who basically say, well, Molina was right, but that means Aquinas was wrong. So there might be a disjunct there. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. So what's happening in Aquinas? Why are you hearing different stories? Basically because there's different interpretations of Aquinas. And there are interpretations of whether Aquinas changed his mind on the will. You can probably, now this, I'm going to betray my own position here, okay, by recommending literature, we always do, but you can probably do no better than look at a wonderful article by Daniel Westberg, simply called, and you could Google it, Did Aquinas Change His Mind on the Will? I mean, it's great when people write, it's great when we just call our articles what they should be. So, Did Aquinas Change His Mind on the Will? It's a great article, and he basically goes through the evidence. What you have in the 20th century with someone like Odin Lotan, who's out of Leuven, he does a lot of historical research on the medievals, on the early medieval, the 12th century as well, and he really made the claim throughout his career that Aquinas changed his mind on the will. He became more volitionist, right?
Mhm.
And certainly this is true, and you see this in the Franciscan authors, right? So you're going to see Duns Scotus much more. I mean, all of the virtues, for example, in Duns Scotus are in the will. There's no virtue of the concupiscible appetite, the irascible appetite, courage, temperance, they're all in the will. So for Aquinas, justice is in the will, but the concupiscible appetite has temperance and okay, so all of this. So that this trend is happening. And another great book to look at is Bonnie Kent. I really like Bonnie Kent. And I think she calls it Virtues of the Will is her book. But it's much more sort of about this transition, not just in the Franciscan quarters, but also in the Dominican quarters. And part of it has to do, we all know, medievals oftentimes point to the Parisian condemnations of 1277. Right, as really being sort of this one of these historical condemnations that sends academics in a particular direction. But there was one previous to that, because Aquinas dies, right, in March 1274. But in 1270, there were issues while he just arrived at Paris. There were issues from a condemnation from the Bishop of Paris as well, and there's a lot of people like Lonergan, who follows Lotan, who say that Aquinas changed his mind on the will and became more of a volitionist. Daniel Westberg in that article pushes back on that. And he does it, for me, in a pretty convincing way. So to go into what was going on at Paris, why did those condemnations come up? There were certainly sort of these very radical thinkers who were complete determinists. They were saying stars determine us because they're higher powers. And so Aquinas somehow needed to break out of that. He talked a lot more about the will as a self-mover, but did that mean he changed? That's where the issue is. It's an argument that's happening today in interpretation rather than necessary. And the argument is whether he developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's a bit more complex than saying he developed or it's just it's both. So.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. But otherwise, it might be about a different conversation altogether that I don't know about. So.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. Well, while we wait for other questions to come in, Justin, I'll invite you maybe to expand a little bit or expound a little bit on one of the chapters that you spoke about, or at least one of the topics that you could perhaps go deeper into. I found it interesting. This idea of can one persevere in graceless virtue, that question, given the corroding effects of sin. I'd love to know kind of the conclusions that are reached by Thomas, and I'm asking this for a friend, obviously, not for myself, but this idea of persevering in this graceless virtue.
Sure. Well, I think most people are aware that Aquinas is willing to completely acknowledge authentic, real virtue in people who don't live with grace, right? I mean, first off, this is a very speculative conversation, because actually indicating that this person, that's very difficult to do, and he would acknowledge that, right? So it's not as though we're pointing fingers. It's just more of a categories we think through. So his conclusion is very optimistic that they can have virtue, and I don't think that's not in question so much. So I don't want that to be misunderstood. But what I tend to point out is there's actually a cross pressure here in Aquinas because of the seriousness that he gives to fallen human nature and the effects, the corrosive effects of sin. So given that rationale, I tend to see him saying, look, this isn't going to go well, right? For someone who's trying to practice the virtues without grace, you're born, because of original sin for him, you're born onto a sloped playing field, right? You're asked to shoot the 3-pointers on the hoop up here. And so you're running uphill constantly in your moral life. On top of that, you're going to be affected by, as we know, the sins of other people, the actual sins of other people around me, my own culture, my own parents, the way I'm brought up, and also my own bad habits and wicked things that I fall into. And as I do, my own ability to judge these things becomes skewed. So this isn't really a great way we're going here, right? This isn't gonna, so with all of this rationale that's very much present in Aquinas, how does he come out so positive? And I think this is a really good question, first off. Is it easy, is it enough to say, well, they just have virtue? Like, the virtue is the reason they have virtue. Well, I don't think that's kind of not really completely satisfactory. And so in this book, I sort of hint at the idea, what about this notion of divine application? What about this notion, which isn't happening all the time, but certainly for Aquinas, he understands that God on the natural plane as creator, not as grace or sort of invasive to human nature, but as creator, he can introduce a new line of deliberation. And by doing that, if the person, continues with that, it becomes possible then to sort of arise on the natural plane from this sort of otherwise moral asphyxia that would take place. And so I tend to think there must be something else in the room here for Aquinas, because he's taking corrupting notion of sin so seriously, to do this. I kind of hint at divine application, and I more than hint at it, I say it. And I point out that God's divine application is always for the good for Aquinas. And so you look at someone like, God, Scripture says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So was God sort of like hardening him and like making him is he making him worse? And Aquinas doesn't read that. So you have to go in and kind of read these interesting scriptural passages that way too.
Thanks, Justin. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Enright?
Yeah, Justin, that was a terrific presentation. Thank you. Very interesting. I have like a sort of a two-part question. One of the things that came to my mind when you were talking is Dante, and how Dante, writing about a generation after Aquinas, shows, Virgil, who I guess you could say epitomizes the just the virtue without sanctifying grace. He can take him to a certain point, to the gates of paradise, and then no further. And then Beatrice, who would symbolize, I guess you could say, grace or theology, can take him into paradise. And I just think, that just seemed like a really interesting poetic depiction of what you're talking about. And then but the second part is really the question. We get, like, in a couple of hundred years, we have the Reformation, and it seems like the emphasis on grace, which is more Augustinian, you said Aquinas came to maybe a more Augustinian understanding of grace, that seems to have not maybe perhaps permeated the church enough so that somebody like Luther could say the church isn't emphasizing grace enough. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Maybe in part, I could say something to it. One of the people that really became a mentor to me along this whole journey of my dissertation was a philosopher in Leuven, but also an Italian who loved very deeply, Ignace made Andrea Robilio, who loves deeply Dante. And because he was on my dissertation committee, I was very careful to stay away from Dante, because I don't know Dante well enough at all to speak cogently to these things. But yeah, I like what you point out. I mean, as for the Reformation, so one of the things that's really fascinating, and again, I'm putting together other people's research here. I'm not sort of going back and saying, Aquinas discovered this, and I'm the first one to say it. It's been known for 80 years or so. So certainly, one of the mysteries of Christian theological history is that the decrees of the Council of Orange were lost for a great many centuries, and this includes the High Middle Ages. And so when Aquinas sort of, I do think it's probably at the Papal Library in Orvieto in the early 1260s, does find these long lost works, these sort of Augustinian anti-Pelagian works. He picks them up like gold, and he starts spreading them around. He starts in the Summa Contra Gentiles already in the mid-1260s, early 1260s. He starts listing all the propositions that were Pelagian. But out of these propositions, I forget how many, he lists like 7, but probably 2 of them were known to all of his contemporaries. So there was really a lack. They knew who the Pelagians were, of course, but there was really a lack of knowledge of what the Pelagian or Pelagius taught, and the Pelagians immediate after him. in Augustine's day at least. So Aquinas sort of discovers these. What's interestingly is Walter Crow, who works in Notre Dame, he wrote on Aquinas on merit and how he changed in his notion of merit. A great book. I use it a lot as well in this. He points out in another article that Matthew of Aquisparta, who is kind of basically one of Aquinas' students, he completely misses this, right? So what's interesting, he's after Aquinas just a few years, and basically what Aquinas discovered and really proclaimed, like, look, this is what the Pelagians taught, his own students lost it in the years immediately following. So it kind of goes back underground. And certainly in the Renaissance, there, I think maybe, I don't know the history of sort of Pelagianism and how well it's known, but eventually it sort of comes to light again. That being said, I don't think Martin Luther, he still would have regarded Aquinas as Pelagian. And he did, right? I mean, most everyone, I think, maybe except Henry of Ghent, was regarded, I think, although I don't know that, I don't know the 16th century reform as well, but I think I've read others say that they would have regarded everyone except maybe Henry of Ghent as thoroughly Pelagian. And certainly even Aquinas on merit, just what he says in his mature writing on merit, would have, I think they would have seen that. But that's not my forte, so that's simply what I've read. So that's not enough to sort of say, well, Aquinas and Luther would have had a nice German beer together. I don't think, I know that's not what you're saying, but I don't think they would. They would have still had a spat. But maybe today Luther would have at least appreciated the fact that Aquinas had tried to take greater account of what the Pelagians were saying than others around him were.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Dr. Enright. Other questions before we wrap up tonight? Oh, Jason wants back in. Is that Jason or is that Ellen who'd like to engage in this conversation?
No, that's me, and it's just a quick question. You can even just send me an email or something, but I'd be curious to know who those virtue ethicists are that don't have virtue as the main thing. You kind of said there's the hardcore virtue ethics people, and then the ones who sort of are willing to bring in some natural law or something. I'd just be curious to hear some names at some point of those philosophers.
Jason, you're going to stump me because I once upon a time knew that.
It doesn't even have.
And that's
to
the
be
danger
now,
of that's the danger of giving a book presentation, because I'm supposed to remember everything I wrote now, and I'm sort of panicking, you know. But no, but it's not even in here. I'd have to go back really to 2011, my dissertation, and see what sort of footnotes I threw out there. But there are some, and honestly, the easier thing to say is that there are some virtue ethicists, contemporary virtue ethicists, taking account of their own movement, if you will, which is greatly diversified, of course, right, since the 1980s. Hume, Nietzsche's a virtue ethicist now. I mean, so this is quite big, right? The Stoics. So they're not going to necessarily be turning to natural law, but some sense of obligation, for example. No, I don't know if I can say right off the bat, but I know where I can look to find it.
Is it kind of, you know, the real virtue ethicists, or do they kind of look down on that as sort of those posers, you know, not real stuff there, or is it a respected sort of movement?
I mean, the big thing, no, by far the pure virtue ethicist, and that's what they call themselves, right? The pure virtue ethicists are the ones that only want virtue as a basic term of reference in their moral philosophy. They're more popular. Do they look down on the others? I don't think so, but they probably look at them as the minority. Mm-hmm. And the hard thing is the greatest other candidate here is probably obligation. But the problem with obligation is, as Anscombe pointed out, and really kind of started this, right? Modern Moral Philosophy, that famous article, was basically, look, you're going to get a notion of obligation or law if you have a lawgiver. And if you don't want the lawgiver, so it basically says Anscombe, right, the faithful Catholic, and it doesn't seem you do want a lawgiver, what are we doing talking about obligation, boys? Right? So and she had a point. So I think that's still, how are you going to get obligation? How are you going to get law? You know, and again, there you have to handle Kant, of course, as well. Is sort of some kind of universal dictate of reason enough to really be a law that I give to myself? Is that a law? I mean, all of that sort of thing might come in. So they kind of squint at obligation, but that's kind of the other. Okay, off the top of my head, Juliana Anis at the University University of Arizona in Tucson. I'm not sure if she's pure, but she seems like she wanted to do, last I read, more with obligation kind of being basic. So I'll out her, but.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Scully, and thanks, Justin. Andrea.
So I apologize, I joined later because I was teaching, so I couldn't get the whole presentation. But I'm curious if you could speak in a way curiously about us as a space, because it's my first time listening to you in this form. You invited me to class. We had several exchanges in different ways. So I'm definitely intrigued by your work and your presence on campus and so on. But there is something interesting that Nancy started with these talks. And I definitely appreciate the space of intellectually engaging with one another and what does to us, in a way, to hear people coming from different faculties, from different environments, from different point of views, and gathering in a conversation that could be, in a way, intriguing for the university as a whole. So it's less on the book and more on the presentation, if you want.
I mean, well, I love what you all started here. I mean, I just want to echo, I said that at the beginning, I'll echo it again. I know Ellen is here and Monsignor McCarran. We've got a little group in the seminary, and I kind of dropped the ball this semester with getting people together, but we usually get together about 2 or 3 times a semester and try to listen to each other in just this way, and sort of a way of research. We've been doing this for a couple years, and we call the group Amplificamus. And so to Andrea, I use this as a way to answer your question. And Amplificamus sort of takes the point of the two reasons, right? First, it's not shout loudly, right? But one sense, it's first off, it's our form of praise. Now, remember, you're talking to a bunch of people that work in a seminary, but in a certain sense, just as we might say all of creation on a sort of Christian imagination, all of creation in its own way praises God, who is its creator. As professors, as you know, we often do a lot with teaching, but we don't do a lot with research. And that's also a way that I think that in our own hearts and minds, we move to praise first and foremost. But the second thing that Amplificamus is meant to mean is that we amplify ourselves. We open ourselves more to hear what our colleagues are doing, and therefore and we don't do this alone, but we do this to enrich ourselves. And we do this to enrich our own understanding of what's going on. Someone who's working with, theology and cognitive sciences is just going to really just enrich me. I don't know anything about it. I know Ellen Scully's here. Ellen presented some of her own research on the early fathers. I just thought, I almost jumped across the table. Like, this is so interesting. I started talking. I stole the floor. I started talking about Thomas Aquinas. Unfortunately, apologies again, Ellen. But I think that's part of what we do as well. And that's really what I think a university is meant to be. It's to be also a way of life. And my most fruitful years, and I love Leuven. I met my wife in Leuven. Our first was born in Leuven. I love going back. I went back for my sabbatical. I love also the culture of being able to, in Leuven, we'd go to the pub, right? And that's much more like going to the Starbucks for us, so don't be scandalized. But it would be after work. You kind of cut out at 4:30 and go have a beer, and you'd listen and just sit around with 4 people who were doing very different things, and you amplify yourself. You become better, and you become more passionate, I think, about what we're doing, and we become better teachers, and we become hopefully better human beings. So that's what I'd say. I mean, I think first off, this is a vertical dimension. This is a way that we can praise God. This is who we are. Also teaching and service, but this is also who we are. And then the other thing is we better each other by this community. So I love this. I love what you guys have done. So.
And let us know if Amplificamos from time to time can be open to non-seminary students.
And I know Ellen Sierra and Monsignor has heard me say, yeah, I definitely want to, and I dropped the ball. We didn't even get it off the ground this semester with COVID and everything. But not only that, but then to help other people do it within their own disciplines, I think is also very rich. Like, right, to get the chemists together and let those in chemistry do it. And I think it's just beneficial to have these, but I love the idea that we're able to do this university wide. So, and in Amplificamos, honestly, I don't know if we'll ever run out of book presentations, but we don't just do book presentations. I encourage people, if their ideas are a little bit more than half baked, bring them and vet them. Right? I mean, it betters you as a scholar to present something. I'm not sure what I'm going to say here, but this is what it is. So I certainly will, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Justin. I think that that response to Andrea's question is actually a good note to end our Q&A on, simply because it turns into almost a promo for this time together, and it's a good summation of what we're trying to do here, and actually is a good kind of capstone type of comment for the entire fall semester here. Dr. Enright, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you everybody for attending, and especially thank you, Justin. It was a really rich and very interesting presentation. Great end to the series for the fall. And remember, we're going to start right back up again in the spring semester. We have several events planned. Dr. Mizaku here is going to be presenting on her book on Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta. So looking forward to that. We have Dr. Maria Moro, whose husband presented in the fall, Jeff Morrow. She's going to be presenting on how to do Lent with your children. I forget the exact title, but what a timely book. And that's coming up. Greg Floyd, Dr. Floyd, who introduced Dr. Anderson, he's going to be presenting on his book, which we had to postpone because we're going to have the talk the day after the election, and some of us consulted, and we just thought maybe since everybody was up till 3 and so forth, maybe better to reschedule. And so, and there, I'm sure we will have others coming across. We have a very prolific, wonderful faculty. So thank you so much, Justin. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Greg, for helping to bring this on, and all of us, Inez and KC, who've been involved with planning this. And so to be continued. And have a blessed rest of Lent, not Lent, Advent, and Christmas. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, everybody.